Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi. As many college football fans know, most NCAA football players are heavily recruited in high school, sometimes even before that, from the time they are 14 years old. And there's a reason why National Signing Day and things of that nature surrounding recruitment are such a big deal in college sports, especially in the United States when it comes to recruiting for football. And it's very well known that only a small percentage of these college players are ever going to make it as a pro in the NFL, and even fewer of them are going to have a lasting impact. So it's even more unlikely to think that some kid who wasn't even on the college recruitment radar enough to get a scholarship or anything of the nature would walk on to a college team completely unknown and rise through the ranks and make it to the NFL. As unbelievable and unlikely as it is, it does happen in real life. And it's hard to believe that with all of the scouts between the NFL and the NCAA, the major programs, the smaller programs, knowing who these players are now, it's unbelievable to think that they would have slipped through the cracks so much. But every single one of them made their college team by walking on during an open tryout, and they managed to impress enough to crack a college roster and ultimately an NFL roster. So in this episode, we're going to take a look at 5 college walk-ons that ended up making it big time. And just to add in a little more fun, we're going to compare and contrast them with other college stars who maybe had the expectation that these walk-ons didn't have, but ended up going in the other direction, to put it mildly. So to get started in segment 1, we're going to start with a surprise position, but it's none other than kicker Stephen Gostkowski. And for anybody who follows the NFL now would recognize his name right away as one of the major parts of, believe it or not, the New England Patriots team in the last decade and a half or so. So to take a look at where Gostkowski got his start at, he definitely started off on a harder note than most other players have to, specifically being a special teams player and being a kicker. And he had to walk on at Memphis, where he went to college, even though he had a stellar high school career growing up in Mississippi. But he was actually better in baseball than in football. And Memphis is a school that gave him a scholarship, but they gave him a scholarship for baseball. So he had to walk on to the football field, and that ended up being his path to the pro leagues. And by 2005, his senior season, he was handling all the kickoff duties for his school, and putting up 39 touchbacks on 68 kickoffs. So more than half of his kicks were landing at an NFL level. And to even add to that, he was using 1-inch tees to kick, which were the height that the NFL was using at the time, rather than the 2 inches that the NCAA was using at the time. So NFL scouts had a little bit of an easier time comparing and projecting his potential to the NFL level versus other kickers whose kicking styles and rules they follow are usually a little off from the NFL standard. And just to add to Gostkowski's impressiveness as an undergrad, in a game that year against Houston during his senior year, he even managed the rare accomplishment. I don't think I've personally seen this happen in a game. I don't know if most people have seen this happen in a game, but of recovering his own onside kick, which until I personally heard about it because of Gostkowski, didn't even know was really possible. And that just goes to show just how much of an impact he made as a kicker, even on his college team. And he finished his career converting 70 out of 92 field goals and 159 out of 165 extra points as his time as a Tiger. And both his field goals and extra point marks set the school record for kickers that was previously held by a kicker named Joe Allison back in the early 90s. So needless to say, all of that earned him first team All-Conference USA honors in 2 years in a row, both his junior and senior year. He was named Conference USA Special Team Player of the Year in 2005. And not to mention that he would score a total of 369 points with the Tigers. That set the school record for kickers, and it's the 13th overall in Division 1A history for a kicker. So obviously he's done more than enough to prove himself since walking on at Memphis, and he went on to be drafted by the New England Patriots, of course, as we know now, in the 4th round at 118th overall in 2006. And since then, he's had a standout career with the Pats, converting about 88% of his field goals, which is an outstanding number, especially for the NFL and the recent slump in kickers we've seen in the last couple years who have been just missing all over the place. Gostkowski was never one of those who fall in that category. And he's also only missed 6 out of 600 point after touchdown attempts in over a decade in the NFL. So, needless to say, he's earned his multiple Pro Bowls. He has definitely put in the work to become a 2-time Super Bowl champion. And he's going down, as of now, as one of the most accurate kickers in the history of football. And it's crazy to think that somebody like that, even being a kicker at that position, would still have to go through such lengths as a walk-on in order to make it to the storied NFL career that we know. And on the opposite side of the ball, and the opposite side of the spectrum, really, we have a quarterback who had the expectations maybe that Gostkowski lives up to, but he doesn't necessarily live up to them himself after he graduated college. And this quarterback is none other than Matt Leinart, who was an absolute stud at USC. But he really trailed off after that epic Rose Bowl performance in 2006 versus Texas. And even though he will always be a legend at USC because of the national championship he brought to school, winning a Heisman as a junior, all of those things make Matt Leinart not just a USC legend, but a college football legend in general. He's definitely going to go down as one of the best college football quarterbacks of all time. But as an NFL player, Leinart is on another list of quarterbacks, and that would be the quarterback bust list, because he looked like the typical prototype of a quarterback who you would probably see cast in a movie to play a quarterback. That's how on point and on brand Matt Leinart was coming out of college. But unfortunately for him, he also looked like he was cast to play a quarterback in a movie when he hit the field. And he probably could have had an easier time with it if he didn't have all these expectations on his back. But he came off the board at number 10, so obviously with that comes big expectations. And it didn't help him that the year before he was set to be a top pick in the 2005 draft, but he chose to return for his senior year at USC, and his stock kind of plummeted after that. And even with that, he still had so many expectations on him from the 2006 draft, but he never ended up developing into the franchise signal caller that Arizona was looking for and dreaming of. And by the 2010 season, he'd been cut. He had a stint with the Texans, and he had a stint with the Raiders, but those didn't really materialize into anything, and he just ended up becoming a perennial backup pretty much in the NFL. And there's nothing really wrong with having a quarterback that's going to be a career backup. Like, you need those quarterbacks too, but it becomes a problem when you spend your first overall pick in the top 10 on a highly anticipated prospect, and it doesn't necessarily pan out that way. That's when it starts to turn into a disappointment, and even more than that, venture into bust territory. That brings us to our first break, but when we come back, we're going to jump into number 4 on the list and go a little bit outside of the normal grounds of college football to find this pick.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we touched on the first walk-on that became an NFL star, Stephen Gostkowski, and a little bit of the antithesis of that, a college star who didn't exactly live up to expectations in Matt Leinart. And we're going to move on to number 4 on the list in this segment and talk about one of my personal favorite walk-on stories, and one that is biasedly a little bit close to my heart, and that has to do with Ezekiel Ziggy Ansah, who was taken ultimately by the Detroit Lions. But before all that, out of all of college football's walk-ons in history, Ziggy Ansah probably traveled the furthest, and not even just in his own personal progression, but also in literal distance. And it's one of my favorite walk-on stories because Ziggy Ansah and I have something in common. He is also of Ghanaian descent, as am I. And he was born and raised in Ghana and grew up playing soccer and basketball to the point where he had never even seen an American football game by the time he was discovered. And it was actually a Mormon missionary that Ansah had a relationship with that convinced him to try and play basketball at Brigham Young in Utah. And ultimately, he did earn an academic scholarship based off of his grades alone in 2008 to come and enroll at BYU. And he also, outside of football, tried to participate in track and tried to join the basketball team twice, but was cut both times in 2008 and 2009. And that led to him walking on the track team, where he showed out in the 100-meter and 200-meter dash races. And that kind of caught the attention of the Cougars football team. And once they took notice of his raw athleticism and his speed, they gave him a kind of crash course in football rules and had to walk him through how to dress himself, put the pads on. Basically everything you wouldn't have to expect to do for a college-level football player. But he slid in a couple seasons as an understudy, and eventually he worked his way up to becoming a starter by his senior year. And even though he started on special teams at BYU, he eventually broke into the regular rotation and ended up being placed on the defensive line. And there he racked up 72 total tackles, 4.5 sacks, 10 pass breakups, even added in 7 quarterback hurries, and he notched a career-high 8 tackles twice during his senior season when he became a full-time regular starter. And he was part of the reason why BYU skyrocketed to a number 3 national rating in defense that year. So, deservedly so, he went on to earn 2012 All-Independent First Team selection and All-American Honorable Mention. But ultimately, it was his attitude, his intelligence, his physical ability, and his resilience that really impressed the college scouts and coaches around him. And that's what really allowed him to progress in such a short amount of time to become such an elite player. And ultimately, he ended up being discussed around first-round draft picks, and he went on to become not only a 3-time Letterman between 2010 and 2012, but also the highest selected BYU defensive player ever drafted at that point in the NFL draft. And in some type of poetic justice, if you will, on the same day that he graduated from BYU, he was also drafted by the Detroit Lions 5th overall in the 2013 draft. And he's had an up and down career since, with some injury problems thrown in there. But ultimately, he was recently ranked number 10 overall by ESPN amongst college football players who began their careers as walk-on athletes during last year's The Greatest Series as part of their 150th college football season. So even though he's had some up and down since entering the NFL, he's currently with the Seattle Seahawks, heading into his 8th season, and hopefully there's just more greatness from Ziggy Ansah to follow. And that brings us to yet another college player that didn't quite make it in the NFL, and this is another one of my personal favorite players at the time in college, and it actually really is a disappointing story as to why he wasn't able to make it in the NFL. And that player is wide receiver Justin Blackmon. And coming out of Oklahoma State, Justin Blackmon had a stellar reputation because he had such a standout college career, racking up over 3,500 yards and 40 touchdowns in just 38 games as a Cowboy over 3 seasons. And he racked up awards, accolades. He was a no-brainer top pick when it came time to draft him in 2012. And the Jacksonville Jaguars actually traded up in order to snag him at the number 5 spot. And that turned out to be a trade that benefited the team they traded with, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, instead, because his career didn't really last long. Even though he put up one good season in his rookie year, leading all rookies with 64 catches and 865 receiving yards, which was a little bit of a flash he displayed when he was still in the Big 12, dominating that competition there. But after that, it really was all downhill for Blackmon. He was arrested for a DUI after that, just 2 months after getting drafted. And in April of 2013, he received his second suspension for violating the NFL's substance abuse policy program. And the second time was an indefinite suspension. So those things really unraveled for him as a player with such high expectations and high potential. Never really even had the chance to see the field for an extensive amount of time, really more than a season and a half, if you really even want to call it that. And since then, he has been yet to be reinstated in the NFL. Since then, he's been arrested more than once and entered a 90-day rehab program in 2014. And that really is all to speak of when it comes to Justin Blackmon's NFL career. And it's really sad to see how so much promise can be derailed so easily by, drug and alcohol issues, which we see so commonly throughout the football world, unfortunately. But in this case, it really gets highlighted because it is the ultimate only reason why a career was cut short. And that just goes to prove how impactful issues like that can be for a player, and how a lot of what we've seen isn't just due to individual players' willingness to play or something like that. A lot of the rumors that swim around them, sometimes it really is just a problem that's bigger than them that they have to work through. And for Justin Blackmon's sake, I hope that he's doing the work and getting the help that he needs. That brings us to our next break, but when we come back, we're going to touch on a walk-on from the wide receiver position.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In the first two segments, we already touched on two walk-ons who ended up making big in the NFL and two college players who had those expectations but didn't really live up to them. Now, in this segment, we're going to head over to the wide receiver position and talk about a wide receiver who came from a small town and a small-ish school in Jordy Nelson. And coming from a small town in Kansas, he was definitely the big man on campus, if you want to put it that way, when he was in high school, since he played on both sides of the ball, both quarterback and defensive back. But despite all that and having an outstanding high school career, he still had to walk on at Kansas State at the safety position in 2003. And he redshirted during that first year when the Wildcats went on to win the Big 12 championship. So he was set to play the position defensive back coming into the 04 season. But he didn't end up playing at all that year and was switched to wide receiver during spring practice after his first year. So even though he didn't really get any action in 2003 and 04, he still managed to catch one touchdown in 7 straight games that he appeared in that year. And luck didn't get much better for him in his junior year when injuries kept him off of the field for most of the season. And that kind of ended up being a disappointment since he only caught around 39 passes and a touchdown. But even with all of that, he was still listed on the watch list for the Blitnikoff Award given to the most outstanding receiver in college. But it wasn't until his senior year at K-State that he finally caught on fire and turned into the Jordy Nelson that we're more used to seeing. And he ended up catching 122 passes for over 1,600 yards and 11 TDs that year, which put him amongst the nation's best wide receivers. And he was even able to add to that and show even more versatility by throwing 2 touchdown passes himself and returning 2 punts for touchdowns. So that added up to a consensus All-American honor, another finalist spot for the Blitnikoff. And by the time his college career ended, he was second in K-State history in receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns. So Jordy Nelson has definitely been the workhorse player of most of the teams that he's been on, and he put in work to earn his spot at K-State, which obviously showed and translated over to the NFL once the Green Bay Packers took him in 2008 at 36 overall. And from there on, really, the rest is history, because he racked up Pro Bowl honors in 2014. He won a Super Bowl with the Packers, Super Bowl 45. And after his career year in 2014, where he really hit his peak, it sadly was downhill for him again after he tore his ACL in the preseason and missed the entire 2015 season. As depressing and disappointing for him probably as that was, there was still a lot of promise and high expectations for him coming back into the 2016 season, but that year was disappointing for a different reason, because his usage dropped considerably. And that's partially due to, the injury of Aaron Rodgers that year. He missed most of the season after going down early. But things didn't really get better for Jordy and the Packers, and they released him before the 2018 season kicked off, where he then signed a 2-year deal with the Oakland Raiders. And it hasn't really been a return to the peak of Jordy Nelson's career since then, but there's still hopefully time to see him return to the level that we know he can play at. And ultimately, if he can stay healthy, if he can have a consistent quarterback throwing him the ball, which we've seen from him, then there's a good chance that hopefully we haven't seen the end of Jordy Nelson in the NFL just yet. But that brings us to, again, the opposite side of the spectrum. And even though it's on the same side of the ball, it is a vastly different story. And I'm talking about none other than quarterback Vince Young. And this name really doesn't need much introduction, especially when it comes to college football fans and talking about his accomplishments in college, because he was electric when he was playing on the college level at Texas. And between him and, future flameout Matt Leinart, it's hard to say who really got the worst end of the stick at this point when it comes to disappointing NFL careers. And just like Matt Leinart, his 2006 Rose Bowl performance earned him so much pre-draft hype. Not that he didn't deserve it beforehand, but it really helped teams overlook concerns about his throwing style, amongst other things. And the Tennessee Titans managed to snag him at 3 overall in the 2006 draft. And of course, not only did they have high expectations, but the country had high expectations. And Vince Young probably had high expectations for himself, undoubtedly. But he ended up throwing more interceptions than touchdowns in his rookie year, 13-12 ratio. And that was also able to be overlooked a little bit, because his career was off to a little bit of a promising start, because he was able to pull off a lot of fourth quarter comebacks and game-winning drives. He was putting up really clutch performances, and that was able to overshadow a lot of the problems that would be brought to light later on, and he even earned himself a trip to the Pro Bowl that year. But it wasn't long before, as we know, things started to regress again. And during his second season, that interception to touchdown ratio just got even worse, with 7 interceptions versus 9 touchdowns. And somehow he still managed to sneak into 1 Pro Bowl in 2009, when Tennessee was on a good run with him as a starter. But he only lasted 2 seasons in the NFL after that. And he never really quite lived up to the ceiling that he established and set for himself in college. A lot of that had to do with injuries. Some of that had to do with his butting heads with head coach Jeff Fisher at the time. But either way, we never really saw that unique combo of passing and running that we are able to see quarterbacks pull off today. So, maybe he was just a little bit ahead of his time, and maybe somebody could make an argument for that, but ultimately it just wasn't a fit with the team, and it turned out to not be a fit with the league, because in 2012, 13, and 14, he tried signing with different NFL teams. He bounced around a little bit, but before each season was able to kick off, he was cut again, and by 2014, he was out of pro football. He was notoriously going bankrupt, and things weren't looking up for Vince Young for a while, even though he signed a 4-year, $25 million contract. That really didn't end up being much for him, but he did try to make a comeback in the CFL by signing with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. But there, too, he was cut before he ever stepped foot onto a field. So ultimately, it was not the best career showing for Vince Young. And last we heard of him, he was hired as a development officer at Texas, But recently, in the last couple months, it's been out there that he was fired for poor job performance, which you literally can't make that stuff up. So ultimately, maybe football was not in the cards for Vince Young on the professional level, and that's fine too, because he still goes down as one of the best performing quarterbacks in college football of all time. And he's already cemented himself in history with the 2006 Rose Bowl, probably the best national championship game that I personally have ever seen, and a lot of people would probably attest to that themselves. But ultimately, not everything translates to the next level. So it's probably better just to appreciate Vince Young for what he was and what he brought to the sport of college football, rather than focus on the rest of his career that didn't exactly go according to plan. At least that's my view. I'd rather judge him by the peak of his college career, which was a treat to everybody who was watching at the time, than to the NFL career, which is very forgettable, and probably, at least for him, he would hope it would be brushed under the rug a little bit when you start thinking Vince Young. That brings us to our next break. But when we return, the top 2 picks and walk-ons are both going to be from the defensive side of the ball. So don't go anywhere.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Before the break, we covered 3 walk-ons that ended up hitting it big in college and further on to the NFL, and conversely, we compared them to players that had high expectations but didn't necessarily live up to them. And that brings us to number 2 on the list, and number 2 is more of an interesting story because he's a legacy player and comes from a line of other football players that even played at his university before him, and that's Clay Matthews, who started at USC. And even though his dad, Bruce Matthews, is a Hall of Famer and a 14-time Pro Bowler, and not to mention was also Clay's high school football coach, Clay still had a hard time breaking into college football, surprisingly, and barely even got looked at by any schools when he was coming up. And he didn't even become a starter until he started to bloom and blossom later on in his high school career. So, trying to follow in his famous father's footsteps, he decided to become a walk-on at Southern California and redshirted in the 2004 season before mainly playing special teams in 2005. During his first season at USC, he was part of the team that won the 2004 BCS National Championship, but he wasn't necessarily a part of that effort since he only played on the scout team, and he turned down every playing opportunity he was given during garbage time, during fourth quarters of games and blowouts and stuff like that, to preserve his redshirt status and all of his eligibility in the NCAA, which was smart of him at the time. And he remained a walk-on, aka on a non-scholarship, a non-athletic scholarship, and as a reserve linebacker throughout the 2005 season, and eventually through putting in good work on special teams and impressing in spot starts. He won over head coach Pete Carroll at the time and finally earned his scholarship in 2006. But he continued to play as a reserve in the 06 and 07 seasons, only making 2 starts in 07 when he was replacing his injured teammate. And he was recognized for his special teams accomplishments more than his accomplishments on defense, since he was awarded USC's Co-Special Teams Player of the Year in 2006 and 2007. But he definitely earned that Special Teams Award and proved that he wasn't just a player that wasn't taking it seriously because he was trying to get to another position. And he proved that when he blocked 2 field goals in the 2007 season while playing special teams. So that was just one way that Clay Matthews showed he was committed ultimately to not just the team but to playing football in general. And during the following offseason, he doubly proved that when he committed to weight training, conditioning, and just programs that were designed to gain size and improve his performance level and stamina. And by the beginning of the 2008 season, they tried using Matthews as a hybrid position, kind of where he would stand in the position of a defensive end, but use the skill set of a linebacker. And they had used this technique on his teammate, Brian Cushing, a year before, and they were trying to use Matthews in a similar way, in a similarly successful way, and he was successful at it. Matthews went on to record 4.5 sacks while playing alongside players like Brian Cushing and Ray Malaga, who both went on to also be NFL players themselves. So not only did he continue playing spectacularly on special teams and became the only player in USC history to win 3 consecutive Special Teams Player of the Year awards, but in 2008 he was finally able to earn his starting position. And in 2009 he was taken in the first round, 26th overall by the Green Bay Packers. And since then, just like his then teammate Jordy Nelson, who we mentioned before, he has been tough as nails in the NFL. And he's now a Super Bowl champion. He's a 6-time Pro Bowler. And he has started almost every game of his career now in Green Bay, up until 2019 when he left Green Bay for the first time in his career as an unrestricted free agent to sign a 2-year deal with the LA Rams. And for all the greatness that we've seen out of Clay Matthews and the dominance that we've seen out of him over the last decade or so, he's struggled to find the same kind of success in recent years, especially due to injuries. And he lasted in LA until he went down with a broken jaw in week 5 of last season and had to undergo season-ending surgery. And ultimately that led to the Rams cutting him this offseason. So this isn't the end of Clay Matthews' story for sure, and he's had quite an interesting one up until this point. So just like other players on this list, here's hoping that we will see more of the brilliance that we are accustomed to for Clay Matthews, and his career doesn't end on the last note that we've seen him. Now, on the other side of that spectrum, to talk about college players who didn't necessarily make it on the next level, there is no one who tops that list probably more often and is probably discussed as the biggest bust in NFL history, more than quarterback Ryan Leaf. And it's such a shame, just like Justin Blackmon in this case, to talk about Ryan Leaf in this context, which is the context he's mostly discussed in, because he did have such a successful career for 3 years at Washington State before he declared for the draft. And it's hard to believe now looking back at it, but at the time in 98, he and Peyton Manning, the Tennessee star, the Super Bowl champion that we know, the Hall of Famer that we know now, he and Peyton Manning were neck and neck in a hot debate between the top 2 picks of that draft. And ultimately, we know the Colts picked Peyton Manning first, and Ryan Leaf went second to San Diego. But his time with the Chargers didn't really start off well, and it didn't really get better from there for him or for the Chargers. He was fined right from the start, $10,000 for missing a rookie symposium, which is probably, one of the easiest benchmarks to hit on your preparation for the NFL. But it only went downhill from there even more. He never topped more touchdowns and interceptions in a season. He never completed more than 51% of his passes in a season. He never won more than 3 games in a season. He did nothing well as a quarterback, and it's so difficult to watch. His poor play, his attitude was horrible, and injuries on top of that saw him retire at 26 after 2 horrible, disappointing seasons in San Diego, and a failed comeback with the Cowboys, and a last-ditch stint with the Seahawks later, and he was officially done with the league. And that was only the beginning for Ryan Leaf's problems in general, because a few years later in 2009, he had a slew of legal troubles that began to follow him. And he was indicted for his connection to a burglary. He was charged for having controlled substances. And all of that ended up getting him 10 years of probation and a $20,000 fine. And if that wasn't as bad as it gets, over a 5-day span in 2012, he was arrested twice for burglary, theft, and drug charges, and he landed himself in jail, only to be released 2 years later. And since then, we know a lot more about Ryan Leaf since his playing days ended. He's become a college football coach now himself. He's been a business development manager, a broadcaster, and an ambassador for sober communities. So looking back, we now know that he's, exposed to the world that he had a lot of substance abuse issues, and he was really troubled with, drug and alcohol addictions, and that obviously, in hindsight, probably impacted his ability to perform on a football field. And there are probably other players that fall into that category as well, who we just didn't know, still to this day don't know. We're dealing with issues behind the scenes that affected their play on the field. And, in turn, their play on the field affected their abuse issues. And, it just becomes a vicious cycle like that. And it's great to see that Ryan Leaf is one that has turned his life around and gotten out of that kind of abusive cycle. And no matter what you say about his playing career, it is always great to see something like that, and see somebody reach their end result that way. But with all of that being said, he is still probably arguably the worst draft selection ever made in the history of the NFL draft. That's my personal opinion on it. Some other people would pick other players, and he definitely has competition there. But you really can't argue with the number 2 overall pick flaming out of the NFL, no matter what the reason was behind it, although it is very much understood now. But it still doesn't go down well for Ryan Leaf's career. And that brings us to our next break. But when we come back, we're going to reveal the number 1 walk-on on this list.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. In the first 4 segments, we touched on 4 walk-ons that ended up becoming NFL stars, covering Steven Gostkowski, Ezekiel Ansah, Jordy Nelson, and Clay Matthews, contrasted with the top college players that didn't end up making an impact in the NFL. And that brings us to number 1 on the list. And number 1 for walk-ons, a lot of NFL fans might not even know he's a walk-on given his career trajectory since then. But it's none other than J.J. Watt of the Houston Texans. And most of the football world now knows J.J. Watt as the dynamo he is today. 289 pounds, 6'5", one of the best defensive ends in the league. But before he was all that, he was a still defensive end, but he also moonlighted as a tight end, a halfback, or whatever position he was called to play. He was still just relatively shy, relatively small, Justin James Watt. And growing up, JJ was a huge fan of all sports, but especially hockey, which is ironic given where his career turned out. But he did compete in youth hockey on travel teams before he finally put the stick down to focus on football. And despite that he was an athlete throughout his entire youth, he was just tall, lanky, and weighed just over 200 pounds when he was going into his junior year. So after his junior year, he put everything out there, impressed, earned all conference honors, only to be taken out by mono of all things. And that really robbed him of his chance to showcase his skills during the off-season leading into his 12th grade year. So having to recover from mono cost him a lot, like the chance to showcase his skills, multiple school camps, combines, all of the opportunities that would have given him the same spotlight and the same chance to be discovered that his peers received at the time. And because of that, he didn't have a monster list of offers like you would assume. And that's because he wasn't really in high demand at the time. He was still undersized. He was under the radar. But Wyoming did take a chance on him first and noticed him and made him an offer, even though it came late in his senior year. But that helped to kick off the slow recruiting process for J.J. Watt. And Central Michigan was next to make an offer, followed by Minnesota, and then came Northern Illinois, and then came Colorado. And he committed to CMU at first because he really liked the head coach that was there at the time. But then shortly after his commitment, the head coach was fired, and he switched his commitment from CMU to Minnesota before the same thing happened, and he reverted back to his original commitment to CMU. So initially, he did accept a scholarship from CMU. He wasn't initially a walk-on, but CMU turned out to be different than what he expected going into it. First off, they were already trying to switch him out of his position because they wanted to use him as a tight end, and after he made that switch, he only caught 8 passes, and he knew immediately that that's not what he signed up for. This is not what I wanted out of my playing career, and I'm way better than this, ultimately. Plus, he is a native of Wisconsin, and he dreamed of playing for his home state Badgers. So after that mundane season in 2007, he left Central Michigan, and he went to walk-on at Wisconsin. So he went from being a walk-on there to being named their Defensive Scout Team Player of the Year as a defensive end within a year of arriving there, which is beyond impressive. And he went on to become a scholarship player who earned all-conference and all-American honors. He was voted the team's MVP. He played 2 incredible seasons at defensive end in 2009 and 2010. And in that 2010 season, he played in 13 games, led the team in tackles for loss, quarterback hurries, blocked kicks, forced fumbles, Not to mention he finished the season with 42 tackles on his own, 22 assisted tackles, 21 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, an interception, 9 passes defended, and 3 forced fumbles. So he was clearly putting up numbers and putting in work in his time at Wisconsin. And he deservedly so ended up racking up tons of accolades, like being voted AP and Sports Illustrated Second Team All-American, All-Big Ten First Team, and even Academic All-Big Ten before he opted out of his senior year to enter the NFL draft early in 2011. And from then on, the rest is simply history in the making as we know it. And the Houston Texans scooped up their future superstar with the 11th pick in the first round of that year's draft. And he's been nothing but a monster since then when he can stay healthy and on the field. Between 2016 and 2017, he only played just 8 games due to back injuries, leg injuries, but he was able to put up a full season in 2018 and finished with 16 sacks, just second in the league behind Aaron Donald. So he looked like he was back to his prior glory and his full potential, especially after being named a first-team All-Pro for the 5th time. But in 2019, his season was cut short yet again in Week 8 over a torn pectoral injury. But he did return in time for his Texans to take on the Buffalo Bills in the wild card round of last year's playoffs, and they came out with a win. So hopefully that is a positive signifier for the rest of J.J. Watt's career, because it would be great to see him back on the field at his full strength and full potential, playing and dominating the game the way we love to see him do. And that brings us to an honorable mention walk-on, and this has to be an honorable mention for me because he isn't currently in the league. It's unclear whether or not he'll be back in the league, so it's really hard to say whether or not his career has been a success at this point, with a lot of question marks around it. But that player is none other than the infamous wide receiver Antonio Brown, and he's never done anything the easy way, clearly, as we've seen from him now. But he did have a really long road from South Florida to Central Michigan, where he ended up, and has in common with J.J. Watt. But before all of what we know of AB now, he was a 4-position standout at his high school in Miami, playing running back, quarterback, wide receiver, kick return, you name it, he did it. But after being denied entry into Florida State based off of his academic record, he ended up heading up to Central Michigan as a walk-on. At the point, he was still mainly a quarterback, but he switched to wide receiver apparently seamlessly, and a couple of weeks later, he earned himself a scholarship. So he went on to play 3 great seasons at a MAC championship school, and decided to forego his senior year to enter the draft in 2010, and that's where he was picked at 195 overall by Pittsburgh, and we know how that turned out for him. He turned out to be a diamond in the rough. He was a 6-time Pro Bowler with Pittsburgh, named Steelers MVP for their team 3 times, and led the league in receiving yards as recently as 2017, before, as we all know, he infamously flamed out, bouncing from team to team a little bit, first the Raiders, then the Patriots, before ultimately being cut for all of his off-field antics. And it's still a giant question mark about where we are going to see Antonio Brown end up. But the way he started off his career was very admirable, and for the talent's sake, let's hope that he is able to get it together and put himself back out on the field. And that brings us to our last break. But when we come back, we're going to take a look at some candidates for next year's draft, way ahead of schedule.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we went over the top 5 walk-ons who became NFL stars and compared them to college football stars who didn't quite make it on that level, with an added in honorable mention for walk-ons. And in this last segment, we're going to take a look at college football's current crop of players who are possibly going to be looked at for going early in the 2021 draft. And as good as this 2020 class was, the 2021 class might be even better when it comes to prospects. And not only does this upcoming class have some great potential at linebacker and cornerback positions, but it could also have the edge over this year's class when it comes to quarterbacks, wide receivers, and offensive tackles, which is saying a lot because this draft was stacked. So as much as the 2020 class was seen as one of the strongest and deepest in quite a while, 2021 might be better on that front. And although this episode included college stars and phenoms who didn't make it on the next level, hopefully all 10 of these choices are players who are going to go on to have substantial NFL careers. So getting started on one of the most publicized and probably the future number 1 pick for next year is Trevor Lawrence out of Clemson. And we all know he had a breakout season as a true freshman in 2018. And we saw him somewhat come back down to earth a little bit as a sophomore. But as of right now, NFL scouts still have Lawrence regarded as one of the best quarterback prospects that they've ever seen. And it's true that he does have the arm power, the accuracy, the athleticism. And given his size, coming in at 6'6" and over 220 pounds, it's still surprising that he can be versatile enough to have a power run game against somebody like Ohio State, but also can become a pocket drop-back passer in a shootout against a team like LSU. With all of that being said, though, there are still scouts and NFL teams who would like to see him improve on some things in 2021, given the season goes forward as planned. And some of those things include being able to take over a game if needed with his arms or his legs, or fully control and command the offense himself, which has been a little bit difficult for a true freshman and true sophomore to do as a younger player. But now that he's moving into his upperclassman seasons, and maybe he'll even choose to come back for his senior season, we never know, but he'll have more of a chance to work on these skills in the upcoming season. And if he continues to develop along the pace that we've seen him develop, he could become one of the best prospects of the last decade. So even though he's not a sure thing, number 1 overall pick just yet, it's way too early to decide that, his potential right now is still through the roof. Next on the list is Justin Fields, and he's coming into the season as a Heisman favorite and one of the most productive quarterbacks that's coming back to a team in college football this year. And he, just like Trevor Lawrence that we just discussed, he has a bullseye on him from scouts and defensive coordinators too, because he is impressive at Ohio State when it comes to not just his touch on the football, but also his toughness as a runner, his decision making, and his arm strength are also assets that he has to himself. But it's been pointed out that his field vision doesn't necessarily stand out as the best, and his arm strength could be a little better when it comes to power, and he still needs to work on improving that. But now that he is getting older also, it is, one, going to happen naturally, and two, he'll have more time to work on, bulking up and increasing his strength, which is obviously good in Fields' favor. And there's no doubt that he is a good quarterback, but the question is whether or not he can transition from college to NFL, at least in the NFL teams' minds. And a quarterback like that isn't always easy to evaluate when it comes to that transition, even though we have seen quarterbacks in the last couple of years who have similar playing styles be able to make it work on the NFL level. So I think that if at any point in time, if it was going to be a successful transition, it would be now for him to follow in the footsteps of, say, a Deshaun Watson or a Patrick Mahomes or a Lamar Jackson. But he still needs tons of evaluation and tons of time to develop before this draft comes up. And luckily, he'll have that over the next 11 months or so to really prepare himself and lock in as an NFL prospect. Next on the list is a wide receiver in Ja'Marr Chase, and when you're watching Chase play, you would never think that he is the size that he is. He's a little bit undersized at 6'1 and 208, but he plays so much bigger. Like, he's 6'4", 220, and can dominate a catch. He can double his speed. He has power. He has body control. And he's one of the most naturally gifted receivers in college football right now. And that really was played out with his connection with Joe Burrow last season. And a lot of professionals compare him when watching him to Julio Jones, which is incredibly impressive since, Jones is the prototypical model of a physical, big receiver that can blow past defensive backs and create so many mismatches. So it really is important to watch Chase this season whenever it resumes and see if he takes a hit because of the absence of Joe Burrow and Joe Brady also now in the NFL. But his raw talent is enough to suggest that he can succeed with almost anybody under center. And if he were to come out of college in any of the previous years, going back to at least 2017, he probably would have been a top drafted wide receiver in any class that came before him. So it'll be really interesting to see what his career looks like in the season after the pinnacle of LSU's, school history, winning the national championship, having the best team of all time, possibly the best quarterback of all time, arguably in Joe Burrow. But if anything is to be said of Ja'Marr Chase, he's definitely a player that can survive the changing of the guard, if you will, in terms of LSU's roster and coaching staff being shaken up. So here's hoping that he doesn't take any type of major draft hit in the upcoming season. Next on the list is Micah Parsons, and he's a rare one and an interesting one because he's a linebacker, and it's not really common to see linebackers enter the top 10. Of course, we saw the 2020 draft class have some candidates along those lines, but what really makes Parsons stand out amongst that kind of group is his lateral quickness, his football IQ, amongst other things, like his awareness and his poise both against the run and in pass coverage. And that's the kind of thing that NFL teams are looking for in the college level to kind of signify how a player can transition into the NFL. But even with all of that being said, it's important to point out that he's not a small hybrid linebacker who's around 6 feet, 225. Like, he is a full big linebacker, 6'3", 244 pounds, with an NFL-ready physique. And he's been the most impressive player at Penn State since Saquon Barkley left. So that's saying a lot of him. And scouts, evaluators alike have been patiently waiting for the moment he's become draft eligible. And their wait is quickly coming to an end. Next up is Jalen Waddle, and he is the perfect mix of what you would call the typical Alabama receiver, because he's like Henry Ruggs III and Jerry Jeudy mixed together. And if you're a defender in college, that's terrifying to think about. But it's kind of on point, because he has the speed of Ruggs, but the route running tree and the body control of Jeudy. And if anything, that makes him doubly as lethal as a prospect, because looking at how high Ruggs and Jeudy went this year, number 12 and 15 overall respectively, Waddle's all-around game could have him go even higher than that and see him drafted even earlier. So we just have to wait and see how his game develops in this upcoming season, with no more Tua Tagovailoa at Alabama to anchor the quarterback position. But his talent is good enough, way good enough, to make up for it, and hopefully he can hold his own and not lose any draft stock with the absence of all the other stars around him. If anything, it should give him more of a spotlight to shine, and hopefully that's what we see from Jalen Waddle. Next on the list is Travis Etienne, and Etienne used to have a much bigger role with Clemson than he does in the past season. And when their offense was really struggling under Trevor Lawrence early on, Travis Etienne was the anchor to help them get back on track. And when you watch him, there's no wonder why, because he's a blur out of the backfield. He's able to dominate on any route you give him, on outside runs. He's like a modern Jamal Charles type college prospect, which doesn't say much for his potential NFL ceiling. So maybe not on the next level, but definitely coming out of college, he's reminiscent of Jamal Charles with his excellent balance, his agility, and his burst. So there are so many ways that NFL teams will be able to use him and his big play ability. So you could definitely see somebody falling in love with him. But it's not trendy to pick a running back in the first round anymore these days. So even though he is a top 25 caliber in this upcoming class, you may see him slide a little bit depending on his performance from this upcoming season. And that brings us to Devontae Smith, who is another Bama standout. And it's a miracle that any one of these Bama players is able to get solo recognition in a group like the one that they're surrounded in. But he is just one of another future first-round wide receiver for Alabama. And that is what got scouts to really take notice of his game. And many in the NFL were really surprised when he decided to go back to Alabama for a senior year. And let's hope that doesn't come back to haunt him. But he does have a chance to bulk up and really show out as the number one wide receiver for Bama this year. So just like his counterpart on his team, Jalen Waddle, he's going to have to prove himself without Tua at quarterback. But his hands and his route running already are NFL caliber, and he is a surefire first-round talent, barring any sudden changes in the upcoming year. That brings us to another wide receiver in Sage Surratt, and he's going to get overshadowed a little bit because, just like in this year's draft, next year's draft is going to be dominated by the SEC, and more specifically, SEC receivers. And coming out of a school like Wake Forest is going to hurt you in some ways, of course, but if it wasn't for all of the talent he was surrounded by, he would definitely be getting more hype as potentially the best wide receiver in this class. and he doesn't have the surrounding talent that bigger programs at Alabama or LSU do, but he is just as impressive with what he has to work with. And during his redshirt sophomore season, he tore up the field with big-time plays, with physicality, and with route running after the catch, which are all traits that translate really well to the NFL. And coming in at 6'3", 215, he has the size and the power to back that up, and it really convinced scouts as to why he could be an easy transition player into the league. But given the competition around him, he's definitely going to have to work really hard this season to stay on radars. That brings us to Najee Harris, who was one of the biggest surprises of the last draft cycle, when he also chose to return to college for his senior season. And you don't see running backs really doing that a lot, especially when they have as much talent and productivity as Harris does. And a lot of that has to do with injury concerns, why it's not a good idea. A lot of it has to do with lowering your draft stock and maybe not playing as well as you have in previous seasons. But leave it to Nick Saban, of course, to be a master recruiter in getting his stars to return to Alabama. So now he is going to be one of the focal points of their offense in 2020. And with a new quarterback under center, not being Tua for the first time in a couple years, they're probably going to have to lean a little bit more on him in the backfield, and not just as a runner, but his ability as a receiver. And all of that combined could possibly make him one of the best backs in college going into next draft season. And last but not least is Dylan Moses, and this is the one that's personally interesting to me, and it's really anticipated amongst college football fans because his return to the gridiron is one of the biggest upcoming stories for the next college football season. He hasn't played football in over a year, so we'll probably see some rust to shake off from him early on. But in 2018, the last time we saw Dylan Moses, his film was spectacular. Like, he definitely looked like he was a first-round caliber player. But leave it to master recruiter Nick Saban to convince his best players to keep coming back for their senior seasons. But in Moses' case, he missed the entire 2019 season after he tore his ACL. And so now we finally get to see the conclusion of his college career. And hopefully he's able to recapture the glory that he had before he went down in 2019. And it just remains to be seen which one of these players, if any, end up going high in the draft and how many of this group ends up making a legitimate NFL career out of their college days. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.